They thought they were pairing up the two people nobody in the room wanted. They had no idea they were about to hand each of them the one thing they'd stopped believing in. Stay with me until the end of this one, because what starts as a cruel joke turns into something none of those people saw coming. And if stories about quiet people who deserve better move you, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. The ballroom of the Crescent Foundation glittered beneath thousands of crystal lights. Soft music drifted over the clink of champagne glasses while successful people laughed under golden chandeliers. Tonight wasn't just another gala, it was the annual Second Chance Charity Ball, an evening supposedly dedicated to helping people rebuild their lives. That was what the brochures claimed. The reality was different, because most of the guests hadn't come to help anyone. They'd come to be seen, to network, to impress, and to judge. Unfortunately, one woman had become the target of that judgment. Her name was Hannah Brooks, 38, quiet, kind, and completely invisible. Not because she lacked beauty, but because life had left scars people could see. 3 years earlier, a car accident had killed her fiancé. A gentleman named Michael nearly killed her and left a burn scar stretching across part of her neck and shoulder. Doctors saved her life. They couldn't erase the marks. Since then, people rarely looked into her eyes. Most looked at the scar, then looked away. Tonight was no different. Hannah stood near the edge of the room holding a glass of water, watching everyone else enjoy the evening. Groups formed around wealthy investors and famous faces. Nobody approached her. Nobody asked her to dance. She had grown painfully familiar with that silence. Across the floor, several women whispered, "Poor thing, I heard she still isn't married." The words weren't meant for her to hear. She heard them anyway. She always did. The comments never really stopped hurting. You just got better at pretending they didn't. Hannah hadn't even wanted to come. She managed a small neighborhood flower shop 3 blocks from her apartment, and she'd bought a table at the gala only because the foundation had once helped cover her medical bills when she had nothing. She felt she owed them the ticket price and one uncomfortable evening. She'd planned to stay an hour, smile politely, and slip out before anyone noticed she was leaving. She was already counting the minutes. Then a very different person walked in. Daniel Carter, 44, a single father who ran a small construction company. 5 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife Sarah and left him raising their daughter Emma alone, working longer hours, sleeping less. There were nights he sat in his truck after work and cried before going inside because Emma needed strength, and sometimes strength was exhausting. But they'd survived one day at a time. Now Emma was 17, and earlier that evening she'd stood in the doorway of their small house with her arms crossed, watching him fumble with his tie. "You look nice, Dad," she'd said. "You should look nice more often." "It's a charity thing. I'm going for 2 hours and coming home." "Uh-huh." She'd stepped over and fixed the tie herself the way her mother used to. "You know what your problem is? You never meet anyone. You just work and worry about me." "Somebody has to worry about you. I'm 17. I worry about me plenty." She'd pointed at the door. "Go. Talk to a stranger. Say more than 3 words to someone who isn't a client or a cashier. Do it for me." He'd laughed her off. Now, standing in the ballroom holding a drink he didn't want, he couldn't stop hearing her voice. Go talk to a stranger. He hated events like this. He owned exactly 1 suit, and he could feel that everyone in the room somehow knew it. As Daniel crossed the floor looking for a quiet corner, he noticed something. Everyone was crowded around the same people, the richest, the loudest. Nobody noticed the woman standing alone by the wall, turning her water glass slowly in her hands like she wished it were a door she could walk through. Nobody except him, because loneliness recognizes loneliness. Their eyes met for a second. Hannah looked away first, the way she'd trained herself to. Daniel nodded politely and kept walking, but the image stayed with him. She hadn't looked sad exactly. She'd looked like someone who had made peace with being overlooked, and that struck him as one of the saddest things he'd seen all year. Someone else noticed the moment too, a cluster of socialites near the bar, led by a woman named Vanessa Cole, who wore her wealth the way some people wear perfume, a little too much of it, impossible to ignore. Vanessa had watched Hannah stand alone all evening and had made 3 separate jokes about her at 3 separate conversations. Now she had a new idea, a cruel one, dressed up as kindness. "You know who he'd be perfect for." Vanessa smirked, glancing from Daniel to Hannah. Her friend followed her eyes and laughed, the kind of laugh that makes decent people uncomfortable because it wasn't funny. It was mean. The construction guy and the scarred spinster. Can you imagine? "Let's introduce them. It'll be the entertainment of the night." Within minutes, the plan was set not because they cared about either person, but because they expected a show. They expected Daniel to make a polite excuse and flee. They expected Hannah to shrink and stammer. They expected to laugh about it over brunch for a week. A few moments later, Vanessa approached the refreshments table where Daniel had finally found some quiet. "Mr. Carter, isn't it? I'd love you to meet someone." Before he could answer, she was steering him across the floor by the elbow. She stopped in front of Hannah, who looked up and immediately understood the way she always understood a beat before the cruelty landed. "Hannah, this is Daniel." "Daniel, this is Hannah. You two have so much in common." Then Vanessa stepped back to watch and her friends drifted closer, phones half raised, waiting. Hannah's face went hot. She set her glass down and prepared for the familiar routine, the man's polite discomfort. The quick glance at her neck, the excuse, the escape. She'd lived it 100 times. She'd already decided to make it easy for him to say, "It was nice to meet you" first, so he wouldn't have to invent a reason to leave. But Daniel didn't do any of the things they expected. He smiled a real smile and looked directly into Hannah's eyes, not at the scar, not around it, at her. "Hi, Hannah. It's nice to meet you." He held out his hand. For a moment, Hannah forgot how to answer because nobody had spoken to her that way all night. Nobody had spoken to her that way in 3 years. "Hello?" she managed and shook his hand. Daniel glanced sideways at Vanessa and her circle, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Hannah could hear. "You look about as thrilled with this introduction as I am. I think we're supposed to be tonight's floor show." Hannah stared at him. Then before she could stop it, she laughed a real laugh, her first all evening. The sound surprised her more than it surprised anyone. Vanessa's smirk faltered. This wasn't going according to plan because it wasn't becoming embarrassing. It was becoming genuine, and genuine moments make cruel people uncomfortable. "There it is," Daniel said. "There what is, your actual face. You've been wearing the polite one all night. This one's better." The socialites waited another minute for the collapse that never came, then drifted away, disappointed to find easier entertainment, and once they were gone, Daniel pulled out a chair at a small empty table near the window and gestured to it. "Since we've been formally introduced by the welcoming committee, we might as well sit. My feet already hate this suit." They sat. And they talked. At first it was small things. He asked what she did, and she told him about the flower shop, about opening at 6 to receive the deliveries, about the strange satisfaction of arranging something beautiful for a stranger's worst day or best day and never knowing which. He listened like it mattered, asked questions, laughed at the story about the groom who ordered lilies for a wedding and then confessed weeping that he was allergic to them and had been too embarrassed to say so for 8 months of engagement. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 40. Neither of them left. She asked about his work, and he told her about building things, about how a house was really just a promise you kept with your hands, about the daughter who ran his life with a clipboard and an opinion about everything. When he mentioned Emma, his whole face changed, softened, and Hannah noticed it the way you notice the sun coming out. "You're a single father," she said. It wasn't a question. 5 years now. He turned his glass. "My wife, Sarah, cancer. It was fast, which everyone told me was a mercy, and maybe it was, but it didn't feel like one." He said it plainly without drama, and Hannah understood that he'd learned the way she'd learned that the plainest voice was the only one that could carry the heaviest things. "I lost someone too," she said, and she surprised herself again because she never told people this. 3 years ago, the accident that did this. She touched her neck lightly, a gesture she usually hid. "His name was Michael. We were going to be married that spring." Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't offer the reflexive sympathy that always felt like a door closing. He just nodded slowly. "So we're both people who know what the other side of a bad phone call feels like." "Yes," Hannah said quietly. "I suppose we are." And slowly they understood each other, not because their stories matched, but because their pain spoke the same language. For years, people had looked at Hannah's scars. Daniel looked at her strength. For years, people saw Daniel as just a hard-working man in a cheap suit. Hannah saw the grief he carried so carefully, the way he'd folded it up small, so his daughter wouldn't have to hold any of it. Then Hannah decided to say the thing out loud. She'd spent 3 years letting other people decide what she was. Not tonight. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "When they introduced us, they were making fun of us, both of us. That woman, Vanessa, she thought it would be funny to put the two saddest people in the room together." "I know," Daniel said. "I figured that out about 4 seconds in." "And you stayed anyway." I stayed, he said, because you laughed at my terrible joke and because you're the first person all night who looked at me like I was a person instead of the guy who probably parked the cars. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt something he'd thought he'd lost. Hope. They thought they were introducing two people nobody wanted, but I think they accidentally introduced two people who actually understand each other. Hannah's eyes filled not from sadness, from relief, and this time she didn't look away. She wiped her eyes quickly and stood, and for a second Daniel thought he'd said too much, that she was about to leave. Instead, she held out her hand. "Then let's not give them the show they came for," she said. "Dance with me." Daniel blinked. "I should warn you, I dance like a man carrying a refrigerator up a flight of stairs." "Good," Hannah said. "So do I." Across the ballroom, Vanessa Cole watched stunned as the woman she'd mocked led the single father onto the dance floor. The music had shifted to something slow. Daniel put a hand on Hannah's shoulder right over the scar, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and they danced, badly. He stepped on her foot twice. She laughed both times. Neither of them cared. Nobody in the room laughed at them now. A few people even set down their drinks to watch, because everyone could suddenly feel the difference between people performing kindness and people actually being kind. When the song ended, Daniel didn't let go of her hand right away. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "Not at anything like this, somewhere with worse lighting and better coffee." Hannah hesitated. 3 years of instinct told her to be careful to protect the quiet, safe, small life she'd built where nobody could hurt her because nobody got close enough to try. But another part of her, a part she'd thought the accident had buried, was standing at the surface for the first time. "There's a diner on 5th, she said. "The Bluebird. The coffee's terrible and the pie is worse. It's my favorite place in the city." "That," Daniel said, "sounds perfect." They exchanged numbers by the window while the gala went on without them. When Hannah finally left that night, she walked out past Vanessa's table without hurrying, without ducking her head, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't counting the minutes until she could disappear. She almost didn't go to the diner. The morning of, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror for a long time. In the honest light of day, the certainty she'd felt at the gala thinned out into old familiar fear. Men were kind at parties. Kindness at a party cost nothing. It was easy to be gentle with a scarred woman for one evening when you could go home afterward and never see her again. But a second meeting was a choice. A second meeting meant he'd had time to think it over. Time to talk himself out of it. Time to remember what she looked like in daylight. She picked up her phone twice to cancel. Both times she put it down. She arrived at the Bluebird 10 minutes early, chose a corner booth, and told herself that if he was even 5 minutes late, she would leave and never wonder about it again. It would be easier that way. It would confirm what she already believed, and she could go back to her safe, quiet life. Daniel arrived 4 minutes early. He slid into the booth across from her, slightly out of breath, holding a small paper-wrapped bundle. "I panicked," he said, "and brought you flowers. Then I remembered you own a flower shop, which is possibly the stupidest gift I could have chosen, so I brought you these instead." He unwrapped the bundle. Inside were 2 enormous, terrible-looking blueberry muffins. "The internet said the Bluebird's muffins are the worst in the city. I wanted to see if you were exaggerating." Hannah looked at the muffins, then at him, and the fear that had followed her all morning simply let go. "I never exaggerate about pie," she said. "But you'll want a lot of coffee to get those down." They stayed at the Bluebird for 3 hours. The waitress refilled their terrible coffee 4 times and eventually stopped asking if they wanted anything else, just left the pot. They talked about everything and nothing, about the towns they'd grown up in, about the songs they were embarrassed to love, about grief, and about how strange it was to be sitting across from someone who didn't require you to explain why some days were harder than others. Near the end, Daniel grew quiet. "I have to tell you something, and I'd rather tell you now than let it be a surprise later. I have a daughter, Emma. She's 17 and she's the most important person in the world to me, and I haven't dated anyone since her mother died. Not once. She's the reason I even went to that gala. If this, whatever this is going to go anywhere, she comes first. She'll always come first. I need you to know that going in." Hannah reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Daniel," she said, "I would think a lot less of you if she didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay, then would you like to meet her?" Meeting Emma did not go the way anyone hoped. Daniel arranged it carefully, a low-stakes Sunday lunch at the house, nothing fancy, no pressure. He told Emma a few days in advance that he'd met someone, a woman named Hannah who ran a flower shop, and that he'd like the two of them to meet. Emma had been the one pushing him toward exactly this for years. He expected her to be delighted. She wasn't. Something in her face shut like a window. "Sure," she said. "Whatever you want, Dad." And for 3 days she was polite and distant in a way that worried him more than a fight would have. Hannah arrived on Sunday with a small potted rosemary plant because she'd learned long ago that arriving with cut flowers felt like a performance, and arriving with something living felt like a beginning. Emma answered the door, looked her over, said a flat, "Hi," and disappeared into the kitchen. Through lunch she answered questions in single syllables. She didn't look at Hannah's scar, which Hannah noticed and was grateful for, but she didn't look at Hannah much at all. It was Hannah in the end who understood what was happening because she recognized it. After lunch, while Daniel was in the kitchen wrestling with the coffee maker, Hannah found Emma sitting on the back steps, arms wrapped around her knees. "You don't have to like me," Hannah said, sitting down a careful distance away. "I want to say that first. Your dad's the one who has to decide about me, not you. You just have to survive one awkward lunch, and you did so well done." Emma said nothing. "But I think I know what this feels like," Hannah went on gently, "because I've been on the other side of a version of it. When someone new comes into a life that used to have a certain shape, it can feel like they're there to take up a space that belongs to someone you loved. Like if you make room for them, you're admitting that person is really gone." Emma's jaw tightened. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. "He spent 5 years being sad. 5 years. He thinks I don't notice, but I hear him. And then he goes to one stupid party and comes back different, and everybody acts like it's the best thing ever. And I'm supposed to just be happy that some woman I've never met gets to make him smile like that when I couldn't." A tear escaped and she wiped it away furiously. "It's not about you. It's not even about my mom, really. I tried for 5 years to make him okay, and I couldn't. And you did it in one night, and I hate how that feels." Hannah's chest ached. She didn't reach for her, didn't rush it. "Emma," she said quietly, "your dad isn't smiling because of me. He's smiling because of 5 years of you. You're the reason he's still standing up straight enough to smile at anyone. Nobody heals a person in one night. You held him together long enough that there was something left to heal. I just walked in at the end and got the credit for work you did." She paused. "I'm not here to take a space. There's a space in your dad's heart with your mother's name on it, and it's hers forever, and I'd never touch it. I'm asking about a different room, a smaller one that's been empty and cold for a while and could use someone in it. That's all." Emma looked at her, then really looked for the first time all day. "You lost someone too," she said. "Dad told me a little. The scar." "His name was Michael," Hannah said. "So yes, I know exactly how much a person can be worth and exactly how it feels when they're gone. I would never ever ask you to pretend your mom's chair is empty. I'd just like someday if you'll let me to sit somewhere else at the table." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then in a small voice she said, "The rosemary plant was a good call. My mom hated cut flowers. She said they were just slow funerals." And she almost smiled. It wasn't everything, but it was a crack of light under a door that had been shut all afternoon, and both of them knew it. Things did not become simple after that. Real things rarely do, but they became possible. Over the following weeks, Hannah and Daniel found the rhythm that two careful people find when they've both been broken and have learned to move gently. He came by the flower shop on Thursdays and pretended to need advice about arrangements he had no use for. She started keeping a second mug at her apartment. Emma thawed slowly in her own time on her own terms. First it was a text asking Hannah which flowers wouldn't die if you forgot to water them for a school project. Then it was Hannah teaching her to make a simple bouquet at the shop one rainy afternoon, the two of them laughing over Emma's lopsided first attempt. Then it was Emma unprompted saving Hannah a seat at her school's spring recital and introducing her to a friend as "my dad's, Hannah," which was clumsy and imperfect and meant more to Hannah than any title could have. But the world Hannah had hidden from for 3 years had not forgotten her, and it had one more test to hand her. Vanessa Cole didn't like being made to feel foolish. The story of her failed, cruel joke, the mocked woman and the construction worker who danced right past her out of the ballroom, had spread through her social circle with an ending she hadn't authored, and she'd become the punchline of it. So when she happened to see Hannah and Daniel together at a downtown restaurant one evening, laughing easy, happy something small and mean in her decided she couldn't let it stand. She approached their table with a bright, poisonous smile. Hannah and Daniel, how sweet. I have to say I never expected my little introduction to actually take. She turned to Daniel, all false warmth. You know she was practically a charity case herself, don't you? The foundation paid her hospital bills. I suppose you two have that in common, both of you a bit well down on your luck. It's really very touching. I just hope you're not settling, Daniel. A man like you could probably do better once you got used to the neck. The table went silent. Hannah felt the old heat climb her face, felt 3 years of learned smallness, pulling at her, telling her to look down, to let it pass, to make herself easy to ignore. For a second, she almost did. Then Daniel started to stand up, his jaw tight, and Hannah put a hand on his arm. It's all right, she said, and she looked up at Vanessa Cole, and she did not look down. You know what's strange, Vanessa? Hannah said, her voice steady and clear, carrying just far enough that the nearby tables could hear. For 3 years I believed people like you. I really did. I thought the scar was the truest thing about me because everyone kept telling me it was, and it's easier to believe cruel people than to argue with them. You spend so much time being told you're less that you start doing the telling yourself just to save everyone the trouble. She stood so that she and Vanessa were eye to eye. But here's what you got wrong that night at the gala. You thought you were handing me a humiliation. You handed me the best thing that ever walked into my life. And now every time you tell that story, you're really telling everyone that the kindest, most genuine thing to happen at your fancy party happened by accident, because you were trying to be cruel. That's not my shame to carry, Vanessa. It's yours. And I stopped carrying other people's shame a while ago. She sat back down, calm as still water, and picked up her fork. The food here is wonderful. You should try the salmon. Enjoy your evening. Vanessa opened her mouth, found nothing in it, and left. She did not come back, and Daniel, staring at Hannah across the table with something like awe, said, Remind me never to get on your bad side. You couldn't if you tried, Hannah said. But her hands were shaking under the table, and he reached down and held them until they stopped, and neither of them said anything else about it, because nothing else needed to be said. That was the night Hannah understood that she had actually changed. Not because a man had rescued her, he hadn't, and he'd have been the first to say so, but because somewhere in the last few months she had quietly decided that she was done apologizing for taking up space in the world. Daniel hadn't fixed her. He'd simply been the first person in 3 years to look at her like she wasn't broken, and it turned out that was all the room she'd needed to remember she never had been. Autumn turned to winter, and winter to spring, the same spring that 4 years earlier was supposed to have been Hannah's wedding season, and had instead become the season she learned to live with a loss. This spring was different. This spring, Daniel took her back to the Crescent Foundation ballroom, which he'd quietly rented for an evening, empty this time. No crystal-lit crowd, no whispering socialites, just the two of them and a string quartet he'd hired with money he definitely didn't have to spare and had spent anyway. I wanted to bring you back to the place where it started, he said as the music began and the empty ballroom glowed around them, because a room this beautiful should have a better memory in it than the one they gave you. And then in the middle of that vast, quiet floor, Daniel Carter got down on one knee. Hannah pressed both hands to her mouth. I'm not going to give you a speech about how you saved me, he said, because you'd argue with me and you'd be right. So I'll just tell you the truth. Before that night, I was a man who'd made himself small enough to fit inside his own grief. And you looked at me across a room full of people who wanted nothing to do with either of us. And you laughed at my terrible joke and you asked me to dance. You didn't save me, Hannah. You just refused to look away, and it turns out that's the bravest thing one person can do for another. He opened a small box. Emma helped me pick the ring. She threatened me with bodily harm if I messed this up. So, Hannah Brooks, will you marry me? Hannah was crying and laughing at the same time, the way she had the very first night. Yes, she whispered. Of course, yes. From the doorway of the ballroom came a whoop, and they both turned. Emma stood there with a bouquet in her arms. Rosemary and white roses, the ones that don't die if you forget them, that she'd made herself. She ran across the floor and threw her arms around both of them at once. Finally, she said into Hannah's shoulder, I've been keeping this secret for 3 weeks, and it was killing me. Then quieter, just for Hannah. I saved you a seat at the table, if you still want it. I want it, Hannah said, holding her tight. I want it more than anything. They married that autumn in a small ceremony in the garden behind the flower shop, surrounded by flowers Hannah had grown herself. There were no socialites, no chandeliers, no one there to be seen. There were maybe 40 people, all of whom actually knew them, all of whom actually cared. Emma walked Hannah down the aisle because Hannah had no one else to do it, and because Emma had insisted fiercely that it be her. When the officiant asked who gave this woman to be married, Emma said, "Her family does," and the whole small crowd understood that she meant herself. Word got back to Vanessa Cole eventually, the way word does. Someone showed her a photo Hannah in a simple white dress, laughing, her scar bare to the daylight, because she'd stopped hiding it a long time ago. Daniel looking at her the way people are supposed to be looked at once in a life, Emma between them with flowers in her arms. Vanessa looked at the photo for a moment, and whatever she felt, she didn't say it out loud, and it doesn't matter because the people in that photograph never thought about her again. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in the world isn't being chosen by everyone in the room. It's being truly seen by the few who matter. The cruelest joke of that whole glittering evening, engineered by people who mistook contempt for cleverness, had quietly become the best thing that ever happened to two people who had almost given up on the idea that anything good was still coming for them. Hannah had walked into that ballroom counting the minutes until she could disappear. She walked out of the next chapter of her life with a husband, a daughter, and a name at a table that was hers to keep. And that, in the end, is the thing worth remembering. The world will try again and again to tell you that your worst day, your worst scar, your worst loss is the truest thing about you. It is lying. The truest thing about you is who you choose to be after the world has done its worst, and whether when someone finally looks at you the way you deserve to be looked at, you're brave enough to look back instead of down. So here's my question for you tonight. Have you ever been the person nobody in the room saw until one person did? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if Hannah and Daniel's story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs the reminder that it is never ever too late to be seen. I'll meet you back here for the next story.